Good evening, colleagues. We are about to start the day's proceedings, the last session probably of the day. Good evening once again. My name is Buddhi Marambe. I'm a professor attached to Faculty of Agriculture, University of Peradeniya in Sri Lanka. It's a pleasure to be here today to be one of the compeers, one of the moderators of this session. And I'll be moderating this session with Ms. Helena MacLeod from the Deputy Director General of the Global Green Growth Institute. I'm sure she'll be on stage in a while. Together for implementation, that's the motto of the 27th COP here at Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. Adaptation indeed is a very important aspect with respect to developing countries. Of course, we are not forgetting about mitigation. People talk of adaptation co-benefits and so on. But the Sri Lankan government and the Global Green Growth Institute has decided to jointly organize this side event at COP27 to understand and to discuss about the scaling up adaptation actions to counter climate impacts. And we are talking about best practices from vulnerable countries that itself speak of the importance of this event. And without much ado, to start the proceedings, let me now invite the Additional Secretary to the Ministry of Environment, Additional Secretary on Environment Development to the Ministry of Environment of Sri Lanka, Dr. Sunimal Jayatunga, to deliver the welcome address and opening remarks. Over to you, Dr. Jayatunga.
Thank you, Buddhi, and a very good evening to everyone. Dr. Frank Rich Berman, Director General of Global Green Growth Institute, Ms. Helena MacLeod, Deputy Director General of Global Green Growth Institute, distinguished speakers, distinguished participants, members of my delegation, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you on behalf of the Government of Sri Lanka and Global Green Growth Institute to this side event, which is jointly hosted by the Government of Sri Lanka and the Global Green Growth Institute, where it will be presenting success stories, best practices, and key challenges for upscaling adaptation interventions in vulnerable countries facing multiple climate impacts, showcasing examples from South Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. Knowledge and experience sharing. Thank you. Knowledge and experience sharing, especially on good practices, are always important to ensure issues related to climate change are effectively dealt with. This is indeed the main objective of today's side event. Sri Lanka is proud to be the main partner of this event. I take this opportunity to appreciate GGGI, Global Green Growth Institute, for agreeing to co-host this event together with the Government of Sri Lanka. The effects of climate change are felt more by developing countries as they strive to balance their economic growth with financing for compensation of loss and damage and for building resilience. One of the main obstacles is that vulnerable countries face in climate action is finance. As our fiscal space is under constant pressure from the impact of climate change. As HE the President, Ranil Wickremesinghe, the President of Sri Lanka, highlighted at the COP27, the time has come where the developing countries require assistance in finance, technology, and capacity building in order to implement the adaptation actions to increase resilience to meet the adverse impact of climate change. Tackling climate change being elevated as a top priority to address by Sri Lanka's President, and the need for urgent action emphasized. Earlier this week, at the COP27 Climate Vulnerability Forum Pavilion, Sri Lanka launched its Climate Prosperity Plan, outlining its national investment strategy for climate proofing of nation and Sri Lanka's pathways to prosperity in a climate insecure world. Sri Lanka's climate prosperity plan is anchored around three major goals focused on energy, finance, and building resilience. This underscores the urgent need to expedite our transition to a green development agenda based on the government priorities. Sri Lanka's green finance taxonomy has highlighted climate adaptation as a key area. The macro sectors identified are agriculture, livestock, construction, tourism, and recreation, and water. The updated nationally determined contributions and the National Adaptation Plan have been identified as benchmarks in the field of green taxonomy. Sri Lanka has been fortunate to receive funding from the Green Climate Fund and the support of Global Green Growth Institute to create an enabling environment for the implementation of the National Adaptation Plan through the National Adaptation Planning Readiness Support Project. Climate change actions are not limited to policy and national programs. It should be trickled down to the subnational level and to understand their priorities and requirements. I welcome the countries who are showcasing their best practices and have coped up in the face of climate challenges today at this event. This opportunity provided at the COP27 is a learning opportunity to enable the exchange of ideas and for the adoption of best practices to search their supports for areas of support needs. The envisaged International Climate Change University proposed by our President will provide an opportunity to broaden the work conducted on climate change and could be considered as a global center for climate change associated studies and research for scientists, environmentalists, researchers, policymakers, development practitioners, and students across the globe. In order for climate change to be systematically addressed and challenges faced, it is necessary to follow the pathway of a green development agenda. In this respect, I take this opportunity to humbly request climate financing institutions to increase grant-based funding and simplification of the process to expedite the access of climate finance by developing countries. Once again, while welcoming all of you to this side event, I greatly acknowledge the support provided by the Global Green Growth Institute, which has initiated many programs in multiple of countries with the vision to make a more climate resilient world. I hope we can learn from each other in commencing technical sessions like this and accompanied with us new ideas, new plans, and renewed hopes. Best wishes for the deliberation. I thank you very much.
Hello, it's lovely to be here. Every day I wake up and I am excited to start the day. And one of the main reasons is because I'm working for a great organization. We're at a critical point in history, and we can all change history. And I'm really proud to work at GGGI. Under our leader, Frank Risberman, our Director General, who has such vision and has created and enabled an organization that delivers so much. I'm very honored that we work with Sri Lanka, an amazing country. We look forward to supporting you to build back even more resilient with high growth in the future. But now I'd like to ask Frank to give some opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Helena, for that slightly embarrassing introduction. But yes, Excellencies, colleagues, but friends, I'm happy to welcome you here on behalf of GGGI. We are very pleased to co-organize this event, this official side event with the government of Sri Lanka. And probably more importantly, we are very keen to work with Sri Lanka to work on this topic of climate change adaptation. Sri Lanka is one of the countries that already had a national adaptation strategy, but we're working together to take that down to the provincial level, to work with the different provinces to work out what that means in practice. Yes, we need strategic planning, but we, more importantly, need practical plans and projects to deliver that finance, to make that planning work worthwhile. That's what we're doing in Sri Lanka, still starting, but as you heard from our colleague from the government of Sri Lanka, there are many initiatives, and indeed the government of Sri Lanka is putting adaptation right at the top of the agenda. And we look forward to learn more about this new initiative of a climate change university. Indeed, here at COP, we hear a lot about adaptation, and I'm happy to see that in the past maybe we had adaptation on one side, mitigation on the other, but there are more and more understandings that adaptation and mitigation should come together. We were also pleased to launch here, for instance, together with the government of Ethiopia, the long-term strategy and low emissions development strategy for Ethiopia, which deliberately integrated adaptation into the LD-LEDs. So LD-LEDs is no longer just about mitigation, it should bring those elements together. And as part of green recovery, GGI has worked with a number of countries to bring the idea of green recovery right into the heart of the country's national planning, to bring adaptation and mitigation into the country's strategy. To see that NDCs for the Paris Agreement are not just about reducing emissions, but to also help generate green jobs, GGI took an analysis of all the GGI members that had quantitative targets for renewable energy and quantitative targets for reforestation, and demonstrated that if the government implements those NDCs, not only will they implement climate action, they will also generate green jobs and actually green growth for the country. Ethiopia's LT-LED shows that under the most climate ambitious scenarios, growth goes up, not down. I think that's the most important messages for Sri Lanka. And we heard here from Achim Steiner that there are 50 developing countries that are struggling to pay for the debts they had to incur to overcome the COVID pandemic, to overcome all these other crises that are piling on top of each other. So how to do that? I think Sri Lanka is right to call on countries to provide more grant funding. But in the end, the ODA, the Official Development Assistance, the grant funding is not going to help Sri Lanka or any of the other countries implement their ambitious climate action. We'll have to come up with more innovative ways of bringing finance to the countries. Some of those countries that can issue sovereign green bonds. Other countries that have reached their that limit, we'll have to find more innovative ways to bring in the private sector or indeed bring in carbon credits. Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement offers a lot of scope for countries to come up with cooperative approaches that they define themselves to find deals of mutual interest to seller and buyer countries to bring carbon credits to countries that need them and climate finance to the seller countries. That is still somewhat difficult issue, but I'm sure that we have speakers here, for instance from the gold standard, who will shed light on ways and means to do that. Why am I bringing this up in this session focused on adaptation? Well, much of the carbon finance initially focuses on renewable energy, focus on sustainable transport. But most of the countries that want to sell carbon credits and bring climate finance, they have their opportunities in reforestation, in mangrove rehabilitation, in seagrass or blue carbon. And I think bringing in those nature-based solutions into the carbon market, which will have carbon credits and climate finance opportunities, while at the same time being key elements of adaptation, that is one of the innovative areas that I hope we can work on together and discuss in sessions like these. So there are some lights at the end of the tunnel, I would hope, including for countries like Sri Lanka. I hope that Sri Lanka can come to agreement with its creditor countries to have some debt restructuring and have an IMF package. But once that is in place, there could also be space for discussing more innovative debt for nature swaps, for instance, where debt relief could come for Sri Lanka undertaking to rehabilitate mangrove areas in the country. So that is another way where indeed debt for nature swaps can contribute to adaptation and adaptation funding in a way where those two areas of mitigation and adaptation can come together in a very nice way. I'm just trying to give you some ideas from other sessions and from the countries that we are supporting in this space. I hope that we'll have an interesting session. I look forward to working with Sri Lanka and our other member countries and to share experiences here and after this session in this key topic of making adaptation work for implementation and to bring finance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank, the Director General of Global Green Growth Institute, for that insightful opening remarks. Actually, colleagues, when you look at the GGGI and the government of Sri Lanka's partnership, it is becoming stronger and stronger almost every day. GGGI is currently assisting Sri Lanka to develop its provincial adaptation plans. So thank you very much for the involvement where the finances come through the Green Climate Fund as well. Scaling up adaptation actions to counter climate impacts. That's the day's topic. For the latecomers, I must remind you that this session, the side event, is organized and hosted by the government of Sri Lanka and the Global Green Growth Institute, and is expected to unpack and explore the best practices and key challenges for upscaling adaptation interventions in vulnerable countries that are facing multiple climate-induced threats. For the next speech, it's a pleasure to invite my co-moderator on stage. Identifying Success in Adaptation and Resilience Project. Please welcome Ms. Elena MacLeod, Deputy Director General of Global Green Growth Institute. Over to you, Elena.
So whilst it's loading, I can see it's loading, I will start talking. So first of all, I wanted to give you a little bit of an overview about what GGGI does. And as Frank has mentioned, we work and we try and be at a very innovative end of climate resilience more broadly, so mitigation and adaptation. Our president and chair is Mr. Ban Ki-moon, and we have about 45 members globally, spread across Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. And I don't think this is going to load, so maybe Ingvild, you can fiddle with this. I don't know, or maybe we'll just forget about it because it's just hung, but it's fine. So I'm going to just talk. So we work both at the policy side, and then we work in terms of putting it into action. So we support NDCs and NDC enhancements in about 30 countries, the long-term low emission development scenarios and the green recovery strategies. But we then try and put it into action and into implementation. And a big focus of that is about mobilizing finance. So mobilizing finance from both the public sector, but also the private sector. And to date, we've mobilized over the last, here we are, we have liftoff. There we go. So, in terms of the impacts, we see that over 300 billion of damages or costs in damage to infrastructure is forecast by 2030. That's a 25% increase from the base level, the baseline in 2020. And of course, we can see it happening. So everybody is aware of what's happening to the world at the minute. Almost, well, every month we're seeing extreme natural disasters. And obviously, Sri Lanka and many of our country members have been suffering very significantly. You'll see from this graph that extreme weather has increased in terms of annual losses by 286%. It's unprecedented. And the concern is that we are way off 1.5 degrees warming currently. Now, as I said, we try and work to put the policy into the implementation and really mobilize from the private sector as well as the public sector. Now, this is the GGGI value chain. And again, just if you look at that long list, it takes you through what we work on. So the development of the economic growth and sustainability diagnosis, the green impact assessments and prioritizations through that macroeconomic assessment, the policy, the analysis of the costs and benefits, all the way through to the financing identified and the implementation. And we work across all those areas of green growth. We're really pleased that over the lifespan of GGGI since 2015, we've mobilized about $7 billion of finance in terms of climate finance. It's significant, and we've done that in a number of ways, but with a big focus on green investment mobilization. And a big part of that is developing projects that are bankable, so shaping the project and then bringing financiers in. But another aspect of that is the green bond work, and I'll come on to that a little bit later. You'll see we have a broad coverage across different countries, and Frank has mentioned a number of the different ways we work in adaptation. It can be mangrove planting and resilience. It can be forestry protection, reforestation and restoration. Also work on circular economy. And two of the examples I really love this year. First of all, I visited Lao PDR, where we're supporting climate resilient sanitation. So they've experienced some increase in diseases when there is flooding, and then there is contamination of waterways because the sanitation facilities, the sewage facilities weren't covered. So the technology can be quite simple to solve these problems, but it still has to be put in place. So climate resilient sanitation, that was in Laos. Another example was in the Philippines, making their agriculture value chain in one of the significant agricultural producing provinces climate resilient. They've had an increase in extreme weather conditions, and what they're doing is supporting freezing of agricultural produce, so fruit, so that it can actually, it doesn't go bad, it doesn't rot. And then we've brought in private sector financier to be an off-taker, And that will bring about 45 million US dollars into that province over the next 5 years. Very significant and a win-win for everybody. Now, in terms of our adaptation work, we work in a number of countries and very honored to be working with Sri Lanka on the National Adaptation Plan. But we have significant experience across many other countries, including in the Pacific, in Asia, and we're building up the number of countries in Africa we're also working with, including Ethiopia. We have a number of analytical tools that we draw on, so our Green Growth Index, many of you will be familiar with, and we really try and ensure that we have a vision of where the economy can transition to and where the key aspects should be to focus on in terms of the green growth transition. Now, this slide just shows you how little money is put into protecting development aid. So for every $100 that the world spends on development aid, it invests just 40 cents protecting that aid from the impact of climate disasters. And I always like to think, if you've got your house, which is one of the most valuable assets you might have, what would you do to protect it from weather extremes? Well, you do quite a lot. For instance, you put a roof on it, and you put doors, and you put windows on it. But if you don't have all that, your valuable asset is really exposed. And essentially, our aid is really exposed as a global economy at the minute. But GGGI brings all these different financing instruments and global knowledge and tries to take the knowledge across the different regions to really help our partners. Now, I just wanted to mention this, the sustainable bond experience that we've had. As Frank said, there's a real opportunity on the carbon transaction side. We also see that there's a significant opportunity on the sustainability bond or the green bond side. And this was a bond that we supported Peru on last year. It was the largest sovereign bond, and it was very large. It was for about $4 billion US. But the impacts coming through are significant. So almost 70,000 people with access to water and sanitation services, over 41,000 hectares of agriculture land with climate resilient practices and technology in terms of water efficient irrigation, and over 6 million vulnerable people with improved access to essential services. Bonds are exciting because they can be very small. We also work on small bonds like a 10 million green bond, and it can be very sector specific. So you can focus specifically on the aspect you'd like to improve in your green economic transition. We're, for instance, combining that with a debt for nature swap in Ecuador as well, protecting the marine conservation reserve in the Galapagos. A lot of potential with this particular innovative financial mechanism, and we need to be looking at all these opportunities to crowd that money in for the countries that really need our support. So just to finish here, we work in a range of different areas, also on the national financing vehicle side, which may be very relevant for Sri Lanka. We do very creative things like with PNG, having a guarantee scheme for the agriculture sector, so enable financiers to lend to small, medium enterprises in the agriculture sector if they're making their businesses climate resilience. A lot that we can do. So whilst it is a challenging time, I always like to focus on the opportunity. It's such a significant time in history. So much innovation is coming in, and we'll get where we need to. Thank you. Okay. So now I would like to welcome Dr. Emmanuel Tachio-Beng, who is the coordinator of the Climate Vulnerability Forum in the presidency from the Republic of Ghana. Thank you. Have you got slides as well? Sorry? Have you got slides as well?
I have
Slides? No?
no.
Okay, I will hand over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting Ghana as the presidency of the Climate Vulnerable Forum here this evening. Excellencies, distinguished panelists, and distinguished participants, Climate Vulnerable Forum is happy to be invited here this evening to be part of the discussions so far as climate change, adaptation, and climate finance is concerned. For those who don't know a lot about Climate Vulnerable Forum, let me give you a little background on Climate Vulnerable Forum. Climate Vulnerable Forum is a partnership of countries that are vulnerable to climate change impact. Currently, we are about 58 countries, constituting about 1.5 billion of countries on the globe, with Africa and Middle East, Asia, Pacific, Latin America, among other countries. Currently, as I've already said, Ghana is hosting the presidency of the Climate Vulnerable Forum. And for us, those vulnerable countries, adaptation is really a priority. And then the climate finance is really, really also a crucial aspect of our activities. That is why when we were in Glasgow, the CVF recognized the urgent needs of the vulnerable countries of keeping the 1.5 degrees Celsius a survival limit alive, reaffirming the importance of delivering the international climate finance and transfer of green and clean technology and capacity building, which is crucial to the enabling climate actions of developing countries, and the need to ensure adequate attention to loss and damage, including to put an end to the lucina of international funding for victims of climate change impact, as well as the urgency of accelerating adaptation, including stronger international climate finance. So it means that with climate change and climate finance, the major problems, so far as the developing countries or the vulnerable countries are concerned, is that the responsible countries are not fulfilling their pledges in order to reduce the finance gap. That is one major important thing that we would like to stress here. Also, that there has been increase in the grant base. Most of the funds that are coming are loans, which is not also suitable for us. And then the processes of actually seeking for finance is also very cumbersome, so far as the vulnerable countries are concerned. And because of that, we are not expediting access of finance. These are real major issues that we are tackling as vulnerable countries. And for that much, this evening, the Climate Vulnerable Forum are calling for action for 2022. And our urgent access for climate finance is in two parts. One, on climate finance, and two, on adaptation. So on climate finance, for the COP27 package in Egypt, we are expecting that there will be a delivery of new climate finance under the new collective quantified goal on climate finance. That is need-based in terms of scale and volume. We are actually looking for responsive to the needs, a climate finance that will be responsive to the needs of vulnerable countries, including not increasing indebtedness, as I've already told you. The more you come with loans, then we are going to increase indebtedness of vulnerable countries. So this is where we don't want to go there at all. And then the finance should be place emphasis on grant-based finance. So this is what we are calling, so far as the package in Egypt is concerned. We are also placing emphasis that this new collective quantified goal finance should also take into consideration lessons learned from shortcomings of setting and fulfilling the 100 billion, which the mobilization became a problem. So this is also one of the things that we have to place emphasis, because if we are going to the same way, then mobilization is also coming to be a problem. And the next important thing is that access to this finance should mainstream and also facilitate the importance of delivery plan. We should have a delivery plan that will help us to really, for the projects to be really to come online. So this is also one important thing that we like to do. So this is on climate finance. When it comes to adaptation, we, the developing countries or vulnerable countries, in Egypt, we are actually looking for a real progress and to secure a standalone implementation plan which is transparent, predictable, and accountability for the realization of the COP26 agreed doubling in the international finance for adaptation from the developed countries as by 2025. We are therefore asking for a significant progress in the operationalization of the global goal on adaptation. This has been our objective, and we hope that this COP will really see the operationalization of the global goal on adaptation, and it is our main aspect of it. And we hope that this will really take us from vulnerability through resilience to prosperity, as we have always considered in our prosperity plan that we'll be talking of. The last and not the least is to furthermore call for a significant strengthening of support of the adaptation fund, which will be grant-based. So this is one important thing that we are talking about. Adaptation fund should not do a lot of loans, but should be grant-based. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel, the coordinator of the Climate Vulnerability Forum. Let's go back to Sri Lanka now. Sri Lanka's adaptation experience and lessons learned will be presented by Ms. Dakshini Pereira, Assistant Director, Climate Change Secretariat of the Ministry of Environment of Sri Lanka. Over to you, Dakshini.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Till the presentation is loading, let me start. In my presentation, I will be giving you a snapshot of Sri Lanka's experience in climate change adaptation. Most of you may know that Sri Lanka is a tropical island situated in the Indian Ocean. Although we are a small island, the country has diverse range of ecosystems from misty mountains, sunny beaches, and blue oceans. Considering the rainfall variation, landscape of Sri Lanka is divided into 3 climatic zones: wet zone, dry zone, and the intermediate zone in between. Sri Lanka is highly vulnerable to the adverse impact of climate change and is susceptible to temperature rise, rainfall variability, and sea level rise, which is critically affecting almost all economic sectors of the country. Occurrence of natural disasters due to extreme weather conditions such as prolonged droughts, flash floods, and landslides deprive lives and livelihoods of the people. As shown in this slide, there is evidence to show Sri Lanka's dry zone is getting drier and wet zone wetter. As explained by Dr. Jayatunga, in building resilience to the adverse impact of climate change, the country has established enabling policy environment with several policy instruments. Sri Lanka has prepared the climate change policy in 2012, and we are in the process of updating it with the formulation of national determined contribution. Sri Lanka is one of the pioneer countries who prepared National Adaptation Plan for the period of 2016 to 2025. The plan has identified 9 vulnerable sectors and has given adaptation actions with key performance indicators, time targets, and most importantly, implementing agencies. Sri Lanka has submitted national determined contributions, and we have updated more ambitious targets in 2021. In that also, we have identified 9 vulnerable sectors for climate change. As Dr. Dayatunga mentioned, we have green taxonomy, green finance taxonomy, and also climate prosperity plan. National level implementation of policies alone will not be sufficient for effective implementation of climate actions. We have identified that. Therefore, we have gone to provincial adaptation plans. We have initiated preparation of provincial adaptation plans with the support of GCF-funded NAP readiness project together with GGGI. Provincial climate cells comprised of heads of institutions in relevant provinces will be established, and climate units to work with the national focal point will be there. We have conducted the first round of consultation, and we have observed high enthusiasm from the provincial level for this engagement. Sri Lanka clearly have identified that ground level implementation is the utmost important. In achieving this, we have identified 3 approaches. First is the restoration of dry zone tank cascade systems and recharge groundwater for the agriculture, that is for the dry zone, and restoration of degraded watersheds in the central highlands to ensure perennial water flow. And then another approach will be to divert the excess flood water in the dry zone, wet zone to the dry zone. Let me explain a bit about the tank cascade system. Tank cascade system, built in ancient time, is one of the 50 global important agricultural heritage systems recognized by FAO. The main principle behind the tank cascade system is recycling and reuse of water through a network of small to large scale tanks. Each tank has specific micro ecosystem which can provide special ecosystem services like sedimentation, water purification, minimization of evaporation, etc. It has also unique system of releasing water to farmlands through a micro canal network. The tank cascade system supports a unique biodiversity and unique microecosystem associated with it. Our ancient tank cascade system is recognized as one of the proven ecosystem-based adaptation practices. This tank rehabilitation is not just construction of infrastructure. It is always linked with ecosystem enrichment and livelihood development. Through government funding as well as funding from GCF and other donors, this tank cascade system is being updated to enhance resilience to climate change. If I may take the example of the Climate Resilient Integrated Water Management Project funded by GCF, done together with UNDP and Irrigation Ministry, over 325 tanks in 17 cascade systems have been identified for rehabilitation with downstream irrigation canals. With this, farmers can cultivate year-round and more land can be cultivated. Ecosystem enrichment has been always done with the community participation. Using the limited water effectively is also included in the dry zone adaptation. As you can see in the slide, rainwater harvesting tanks were introduced and the users were trained to manage the systems. With these, families are ensured water in the dry period for their essential household work. Home gardening and cultivation in polytunnels was also encouraged for food security and also for the extra income. Incentive schemes were introduced for sprinkler systems and drip irrigation to small-scale farmers to effective use of water. Farmers were given awareness on non-chemical fertilizer and new markets were introduced. Women are identified as most impacted from this climate change. In order to build resilience, women are trained and encouraged to start new income-generating activities. Value addition of products by packaging, processing, making craft are some of these activities. Coming into second approach, there are many efforts going on scattered on the Central Highland in restoration of the important landscape. It is identified that all these efforts have to be coordinated and should have a holistic approach. One of the larger projects initiated in this is the DCF-funded project called Strengthening Climate Resilience of Subsistence Farmers and Agricultural Plantation Communities residing in the vulnerable river basin watersheds and downstream of Knuckles mountain range catchment of the Sri Lanka. There are government-funded restoration programs as well as programs funded by Green Climate Fund, JEF, World Bank, etc. implemented in this area. Taking all these projects as a whole, one of the most important elements identified in these projects were the community participation in land restoration. Vulnerable communities were identified in the area and the soil conservation measures were taken together with livelihood development. This is very important for sustainability of project implementation and actions even after completion of the project. Organic farming, value addition of products, and women empowerment was also initiated in the Central Highland. Our third approach is the diversification of excess flood water in the wet zone to the dry zone. The next opportunity lies with the natural geomorphology of this island. As you can see on the map, we have central hill mass with slopes aligning to southwestern and northeastern directions. With changing climate, wet zone is getting more rain. If this excess water can be channeled to the dry zone of the country, it will minimize the flooding in the wet zone as well as it will provide a solution to the prolonged droughts. In this, the main challenge we face is in this strategy is identification of proper methodology and also channeling path to minimize damage to infrastructure and rich ecosystems of the country. Taking all these approaches, we always find a major challenge is the financing. If financing is lacking even to implement the activities identified in the NAPs and NDCs. Lack of coordination between agencies and lack of awareness is also identified, and we are working on with the support of NAP Readiness Project in improving it. Thank you.
Dakshini, thank you so much for those inspiring examples. Really lovely to see concrete actions on adaptation and resilience, and such beautiful photos as well. So now I'm really pleased to present three very special speakers working in 3 countries that we've showcased here as partners of GGGI that we're supporting. They'll present specific examples of climate change adaptation that represent diverse experience and lessons learned from GGGI and other projects and programs implemented. So I'll introduce them all now, and then maybe they can come one after the other. First of all, there will be Mr. Vinay Singh, Director of Waterways in the Republic of Fiji. Be lovely to hear about Fiji. I used to live in Fiji for a few years. Then Mr. Mohammed Abbas, Director of the Economic Analysis and Policy Research Director at the Ministry of Planning and Development, Ethiopia, another country close to my heart. And Mr. Tavan Ketifone, Deputy Director of Adaptation Division, Department of Climate Change, Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment, Lao PDR. I had a wonderful visit to Lao earlier in the year, very inspiring. Can I ask the presenters to come and sit up here, and then in that order come and present? That would be lovely. Thank you so much.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, and panelists, greeting to you all, or I would rather say, Bulo Vinaka to you all. Given the time of the day, I'd rather be very quick. Let's do a quick run around with an innovative adaptation project that Fiji has, and Fiji has been showcasing using a nature-based solution effort, a very cost-effective project. Before I start, we all know that the Pacific is very vulnerable of facing the full brunt of the climate calamity before us. Climate financing is a major issue in the Pacific. Using with the pilot of projects, there is huge challenges ahead. But once we are able to pilot the project and show the proof of concept, we are able to secure further funding. And such is the case with a nature-based solution seawall project by our Ministry of Waterways in Fiji. So this is a grant recipient. We are the grant recipient of several donor fundings, one being the Kiwa initiative, funded by the European Union, Canadian government, Australia, New Zealand, administered by SPC, IUCN, and SPREP. We are also the recent recipient of the Asian Development Bank, current Blue Bond prospectus that we have launched in COP27, and further, we have recently been announced the recipient of the Adaptation Fund. This particular project aims to reduce coastal erosion effects to vulnerable communities in Fiji, that is, with issues with climate calamities of sea level rise. So with the Kiwa initiative, we are trying to target 6 particular communities, and these particular communities are spread over Fiji, as Fiji is an archipelago of 333 islands. We are trying to focus more on 6 of the projects that is currently funded by IUCN. Now, with this particular approach, we try to work with objectives of strengthening community institutional awareness and knowledge on coastal management. We use infrastructure and livelihood to reduce vulnerabilities of coastal inundation. And further, we use nature-based solution efforts to establish these innovative seawalls for a long-term adaptation efforts. With this, we are rehabilitating close to 6 acres of coastline, and this has an approach of 12,000 plants of mangroves with 3,000 vetiver plantings that has proven ability of holding or binding the soil together. We target close to 60% women and children with a direct recipient or direct approach of close to 1,450 individuals. We then provide each and every site with the rehabilitation of vetiver and mangrove nurseries, and we share knowledge and capacity on the job trainings as well. Before we can start up with any sort of a consultation, we use a very bottom-up approach. We include all the communities, we provide them with proper consultations. At the same time, we use efforts and knowledge that is available within the communities embedded within our NBS system seawalls. Main activities we undertake under this is consultations and awareness on the nature-based solutions. We further provide, or we look into scientific research, being climate risk and vulnerability assessments, and then we look into biodiversity impact assessment reports. Something very unique is our nature-based solution seawall design. We use 3-layered approach. 1 being the natural defense of mangrove. 2, using of natural boulders, which are minimum 1 meters to 2 meters in diameter, each weighing close to a minimum of 800 to 1.2 tons. And then we use a 3rd-layered approach using a bunding system using clay, rotten rocks, or soapstone. And the 4th layer, we plant vetiver grass on top, so the soil can all, the vetiver root system can bind the soil together and provide a natural seawall formation. Typical intervention that we have done in Fiji, we have built close to 8 of these seawalls, and now with the help of several fundings and our close a friend from the United Nations Development Program, Vinil, we will definitely be looking into close to further 15 particular sites in which we have done feasibility analysis. We are also working together with our friend from the CFN network and GGGI, Shelvin, to scale up further nature-based solution projects in Fiji. At the same time, we are also exploring innovative financing options of results-based financing for mangrove growth. We are also looking into parametric insurance to better provide adaptation projects that is going to provide with climate calamities if there happens to be a cyclone that damages these particular seawalls. And then we are also trying to, moving forward, use VCS or carbon mechanism system for coastal communities. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting Ethiopia and giving the opportunity to present our experience on development of LT-LED's long-term strategy of Ethiopia. Yes, okay. Okay. This is Abbas Mohammed from Ministry of Planning and Development, Ministry of Planning and Development of Ethiopia. So I want to present for you the development process of the Ethiopian longer-term strategy towards decarbonization to net zero. So here I want to concentrate on 2 major or unique experiences and lesson learned on the development process of the longer-term low carbon emission development strategy of Ethiopia. The first one was the process of developing the LT-LEDs was unique for us as far as we have an experience on the previous strategies that were developed. The entire process of developing the long-term Ethiopian long-term low emission development strategy was led by Ministry of Planning and Development with a technical support from GGGI and financial support from France Development Agency. So, and I would like to use this opportunity to thank GGGI and France Development Agency for their support on the entire process of development of this LTD. So, we have the Ministry of Planning and Development established a steering committee which is specific to this LTLs, and this steering committee was, the main mandate of the steering committee was it will act as an advisory board for the process, and of course give an oversight and the guidance and endorse all stages of the development of LTLs. And the steering committee has a member of line ministries, pertinent line ministries, which has directly related with this climate resilient development strategy, and AFD and the GGI was part of the steering committee member. And parallel to this, we have a technical working group. 7 technical working group was established, pertinent to the direct sectors that are included in the development of all the LTLs, such as energy, agriculture, waste, and climate adaptability and macroeconomy. So a series of workshops and capacity building was provided for the technical working group, and this technical working group has the main mandate of developing the models that are used for the projections in the LTLs. And through this, we created a capacity in the line ministries and in the public organs, and for the last almost 1 year, this working group and the technical experts from GGI was working hand in hand on development of this process. So what you have learned from this process was, before we have a climate resilient green strategy, which was approved and endorsed in 2011, and this document was entirely produced by hiring consultants, and we were not created a capacity in public institutions. So this process led us to create a capacity, institutional capacity, that is now the whole process, and the document is owned by the government as well. And the next we have learned from this process is we have an updated NDC which was submitted for UNFCCC in the last July, but the last 2 NDC was not included adaptation, but they include the mitigation aspect. But in this LTLs, we include the adaptation aspect, not only the mitigation. These 2 unique features was a lesson learned in this process. And the benefits of the Ethiopian LTLs until 2050, from the economy side, on average, we have 1.8, around 2 percentage points in annual growth when we compare to the BAO, or business as usual scenario. The net zero emission scenario has about 2 percentage point additional growth on GDP on average, and 66% of the net zero emission scenario GDP is much higher than the BAO scenario. It's around 66%, and reduction of import dependency, like we entirely depend on fuel importation, and we can save around 4 billion USD on the implementing the LTLs. On agriculture sector, the same story is happened. And in green jobs, on average, in every year, we have around 900,000 jobs additional when we implement these LTLs. And in forest and the land sector, we can reforest around 8 million hectares, and total land restored is around 60 million. This all, not only this is a direct impact on forest, and this has an indirect impact on green jobs and other health sector impacts. So these are the additional benefits that will that will acquired when we implement these LTLs. This is all what I have in presentation. Thank you so much.
Okay, let's wait for something gets wrong with touch screen. Okay. Okay. But I cannot touch. Okay. Okay, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me as Ministry of Environment from Laopedia to provide some best practice from adaptation and key concern from Laopedia. So in my context, I have a short brief introduction and on the national context and some practice on adaptation project and gap and needs. Next slide, please. Hello. Okay, thank you. So, based on some research on regional researchers showing that Laopedia is also located in one of the most climate change vulnerable to the climate change, and the most affected on the 2018 the flooding is estimated 2% of GDP, and most of the affected people is 600,000 people, and because of that, Lao government will trying our best to combat with the climate change, and we come up with the policy frameworks such as the National Climate Change Strategy and Disaster Management Law and the Climate Change Decree. And right now we are on implementing the National Adaptation Plans, which are supported by GGGI and UNEP and UN Habitat. And we also found out that we still need to improve the quantitative targets and indicators and measure for progress on adaptation. Next slide, please. So according to the second NDC toward 2025, we come up with the 6 vulnerable sectors, and most of the sectors, our target is most mainstreaming climate change adaptation in the sectoral strategies, and the health sector is come up with the HNAP, and right now they are doing on the implementation of the HNAP. And also the Lao government is working with GGGI on development of the NDC implementation plan, which will complete early 2023. Yes. So some example of our research on the update NDC showing that the unconditional and the conditional toward net zero 2050 to net zero. We hope that with the support from developed partner and the financial support can help us to achieve this net zero emission. And this slide showing some example of our plan toward to net zero emission 2050 that by achieving the target set under both unconditional and conditional mitigation scenario allow achievement. We also starting with the LT grid, and we hopefully to finish in the next 2 years, and also implementing the national adaptation plan. Yet. So for the adaptation project, I would like to present some sample of the 3 projects. So the first one is the building resilience of urban population with the ecosystem-based solution in Lao PDR, which funded by GCF. So this is the first project that we got from the GCF, and it took around 8 years to finish, to get the funded. So the key outcome of this project mostly on the integrated flood management practice, and also doing some wetland management plan, rehabilitate wetland, and also restore nature urban stream in the 4 major cities in Lao PDRs. And the second project is the ongoing for the national adaptation planning process. So we have done with the roadmap, and we hopefully we can finish by the end of 2024 and submit to the UNFCCC with the supporting with GGGI and also UN Habitat and UNEP. So the last project is on the Asia Pacific project. Is kind of regional projects which cover 3 countries: Bhutan, Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos. So this will use the EBA intervention to the community in the rural areas. So I would like to show some best practice for the intervention of EBA to the northern province, because mostly Laos is located in the mountain. So this area is really limited to access to the clean water and also the use of water. That's why we try to introduce the EBA intervention to this province. So we try to do the planting tree to the mountain and the top of the reservoir, and to help the water shortage in the high mountain. And also enhancing the water shortage capacity for water supplies, because EBA also the new concept for the Lao PDR, and we hope that this project will help Lao government and also the community to understand more how to live with the environment, and also use the environment to be more beneficially. Next, please. Yes, and another EBA intervention applied to the northern province, and another province will help to use green and gray infrastructure to improve the drainage system and try to use the EBA intervention. Yes. And right now we are, the government of Lao PDR, especially on the Ministry of Environment, is working closely with GGI to develop the new project, and hopefully to get funded from the New Zealand government. And the key concept for us is try to use the nature-based solution and apply to the urban city, and how to use the NBS to reduce the flooding in the urban area, and also try to introduce more the EBS solution to the private sectors. Yes. So for my last slide, the gap and needs for Lao PDR. So we try to improve the technical information and knowledge, especially on the climate vulnerable sectors and for example, the downscaling climate scenario, and also the integration of resilience and adaptation principle into the sectoral strategy, action, and plan. And we still lack of monitoring and evaluation frameworks on the adaptation sectors and also the climate monitoring. This is also the difficult part, how to monitor the adaptation works with other key vulnerable sectors. And of course, we will tying our best to work with our development partners and also how to make more financial support on the help the Lao government and Lao country to combat with climate change. And we also interesting with Dr. Frank said in the earlier that we should consider on the carbon market that we have potential in our country because we have most of the forest in the land area. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, our distinguished guests from Fiji, Ethiopia, and Laos PADR for sharing their experiences. Climate finance have been discussed by many speakers, and about the need has been expressed by many. We learned that adaptation projects represent less than 10% of the overall climate-related development assistance in the global scenario as well. So to speak on climate finance, financing perspectives, what is needed to successfully scale adaptation interventions. Let me now invite Ms. Sarah Lugas, the Chief Strategy Officer of Gold Standard. Over to you, Sarah.
Such a simple question I have to answer tonight, late night, with tired people. But thank you very much for inviting us to be part of this conversation. I am Sarah Lugers from Gold Standard, and probably worth talking about a bit about Gold Standard. Really, we are meant to catalyze finance and maximize its impact. We've been around for almost 20 years. Originally created from a bunch of NGOs who were concerned that the original kind of flexibility mechanism, market mechanism to catalyze finance for not only mitigation, but sustainable development wasn't quite living up to its promise. So our job was to do two things: to ensure environmental integrity in climate mitigation, and also to make sure that the UN's Clean Development Mechanism originally lived up to that D, the development promise that it made. So we've always thought about these things as hand in hand, climate mitigation with sustainable development, of which adaptation is a part. So it's really exciting to see this front and center now at COP finally. And then to think about how we use those fundamentals from carbon markets, the safeguarding principles, the stakeholder inclusivity, the rigorous methodologies in MRV and independent verification and trust in impact claims. How do we look at new innovative and scalable mechanisms to drive finance for new needs that are becoming a reality more quickly every day in terms of adaptation and resilience? So, I mean, one of the key elements we've heard a lot about already, and it seems simple, but it's really capacity, capacity, capacity. And it's throughout the value chain, right? We're looking at what investors need. Investors need to build their capacity to help understand the risks that they face, the likelihood, the scale, the exposure. And we need local knowledge to understand how to take these, really in-depth and complex national adaptation plans and how to apply that to the local context. And also, how do we learn how to measure that risk and define hazards and the adaptive solutions at the project level where finance ultimately is invested? So it also involves talking. We just heard a lot about that in the most recent presentations. It's about stakeholder engagement of all sorts. And it's softer skills like patience and partnerships. Sometimes investors are very interested in moving fast, and these types of consultations and engagement take some time. And so understanding, having patient capital, understanding long-term risk and long-term opportunities is really key. And when thinking about risks and how to think about new and various instruments that can be brought to bear, we can use carbon credits. Obviously, Gold Standard has a rich history there. We can think about not just necessarily catalyzing more finance, but shifting finance. We hear all the time that there's no good projects, or we hear that there's no finance, but how do you bridge that gap through this capacity building and through these new instruments? So one thing that I'd like to talk about from Gold Standard's perspective is, we haven't heard about this too much tonight, which is the opportunity of blended finance. Gold Standard is looking at how we look at blended finance mechanisms. We have fund requirements that apply at the portfolio or the fund level, that we really work hand in hand on that capacity building on the investor side to help them manage, measure, and maximize the impact of the finance that they invest. And how do we look at that holistically to drive scale, not just in mitigation, but also to a broad range of SDGs. So it's unfortunate that the Green Climate, the GCF wasn't able to join us tonight, because they were the catalyst to start our first use case, our first pilot under the fund requirements, which is the Subnational Climate Finance Initiative, which includes 150 million first loss concessional finance from GCF, and it's using private equity to invest, to attract private investment, and to look all the way through the investment cycle, from project decisions, from eligibility criteria, through the management and measurement of impact into credible claims, so that impact investors aren't just claiming to be green or to be sustainable, that they're actually delivering on what they promise. So in that, this was a perfect opportunity for us to look at how does adaptation play a role there. So Gold Standard currently has adaptation framework out for public consultation. And why another framework, why another standard for adaptation? And we think there are a few reasons for that. And the first is to look at where the gaps are. And we see a lot of standards and requirements for the built environment, for infrastructure. But how do we look at smaller urban projects within a broader urban plan, smaller agricultural activities, et cetera? So filling those gaps in applicability, and then taking these, again, I mentioned the broad plans at the global, regional, national level, which are excellent for planning and risk assessment, but again, the money at the end of the day actually flows to projects on the ground. So you need data at that local level and the local expertise to be able to devise solutions for adaptive capacity. And then finally, to recognize along those same lines that there need to be pragmatic approaches in line with those plans, but being able to think about, for example, there was a pilot that we ran in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where the global IPCC data wouldn't have been able to identify the landslide risks that were relevant when they were planning local greenways. Or in the Galapagos, where microclimates and very sensitive areas at a very small resolution have an impact on ecotourism and community development. So we're trying to bridge those gaps, build capacity, bring people together, and make sure that the bankable projects meet the capacity on the ground. So I hope that we can partner with the countries that we heard from today and continue our collaboration with GGGI and help scale finance for adaptation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Sarah. As she said, Ms. Lillian Macharia, who was to speak at this forum, who is the Director of Portfolio Management of Green Climate Fund, could not make it, unfortunately, due to unavoidable circumstance. Let me invite on stage my co-moderator, Ms. Elena MacLeod. Dr. Emmanuel, I think he's here today. Dr. Emmanuel, would you mind coming on stage? And also Dakshini on stage. We'll open up for 1 or 2 questions from the audience. And there'll be mics, few mics being circulated, right? Mobile mics? Any questions, colleagues? Yes. There's a mic, please. Please identify yourself and then ask a question.
Okay, my name is Riyaz Sangani. I'm from Sri Lanka. My question is about the green bonds. We talked about the green bonds, and you said, I understand the green bonds, but it will have some development impact. People may subscribe for it for climate change reasons. But how is the economics of it? Will it be, to pricing it, will it have the similar economic returns as other bonds, or will it be above or below, or how does that work out?
It's a great question. So I am not a bond expert, but I've been pretty inspired by our bond experts. So many countries issue bonds, most countries issue bonds, but the green bonds are just going like earmarking for specific sectors. And what's been found is that there's often a green premium, sometimes called a greenium, which means that because there's so much demand for these bonds, they're actually cheaper for the government. So it can be a very positive fiscal investment going for a green bond. So I would suggest it is something that governments should include in their repertoire. And interestingly, globally, only 1% of the total bond market currently is green. So if we have even a relatively small shift of the amount of investment of all the bond market in green, you could have a very significant drive of investment, scaled up investment in the climate and green space. So a little bit of a long answer, but yes, there can be a very positive fiscal aspect to green bonds.
Thank you very much, Elena. Any other questions? Can you please use the mic? Yeah. Please identify yourself.
So my name is Varda Malik. I'm from Pakistan. So my question was that Pakistan had floods in 2022, probably the biggest floods we've seen in the history of the country. For adaptation, the needs have been identified as $33 billion, and no donor is coming forward. What the World Banks and the other donors are doing, they're repurposing the entire portfolio to take out money from existing projects, and no specific products have been developed for this. There is no cat bond, even ideas floated. The green bond question actually also ties into this whole thing. Pakistan issued a green bond last year for the construction of 2 large hydel programs. We got oversubscription by 3 times. For a country like Pakistan, which on economic front was not doing very well at that point in time. Oversubscribed, the yield was very good. For the borrower, the country Pakistan, it was amazing because it was 8%, which was half of what we would have borrowed at from any other sources. So the economics are quite good. Investors, so the lines between impact investors and regular investors is blurring now. Nobody wants to invest if it's not green anymore. So I think the economics are perfect for green bond, blue bonds, and all those kind of things, and cat bond for that matter. But my question for GGGI is that for a country like Pakistan, what should be the first step to get support and technical assistance like other countries have benefited from GGGI?
A wonderful question. So we are looking forward to Pakistan, I think, being a member. Yes, wonderful. And we're engaging with you. Now, we're not one of the richer intergovernmental organizations. We're not a financier. So we have to work with you, starting in perhaps a fairly small way with funding proposals. We often come into a country working with you on the readiness. So we start with the readiness funding, but every dollar that we get in terms of funding, we try and leverage at least 50 times for our partner countries. So that's the first thing. If we come in with the readiness, we're looking to see how we can significantly mobilize many, many more times that readiness for you. That could be through private sector, it could be through other types of development funding. So one opportunity would be readiness. There are other opportunities we have, for instance, incorporating in regional programs where we can start work. Then we come in once we have a team in country, then we usually find it's quite smooth to expand. So I would say we work together, we set a very clear action plan of what your priorities are. And I think Pakistan is in a very, unfortunately, situation where there will be funders wanting to work with you. So I think we can mobilize the funding, but we just need to be very clear on the level of priorities. I do think it's very stark, of course, what's happened in Pakistan. I think it's a terrible example for the world about what can happen. But I do hope other countries will see, for instance, some of the work on sponge cities, flood resilience investments, nature-based solutions. Those, we call them technologies. They're very straightforward, simple in, planting of trees and nature-based solutions in certain ways. There's so many things that can be done to prevent, to a degree, what has happened in Pakistan. But we do want to work with you to build back better and stronger. And those opportunities like the green bonds, the debt for nature swaps, they may be priorities for you that we can look at working with you on more quickly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elena. Well, colleagues, in the interest of the time, the officers who are here are requesting us to wind up the situation. So let me close the session. But before that, Elena, I know you answered both questions, but I want you to sum it up.
Thank you.
Very quickly.
Thank you so much. Look, first of all, I think the ministries of finance really have to be brought on board. And I was at the Coalition of Finance Ministers last week. Everyone's talking about adaptation and mitigation, but everything has to be seen through a green growth lens. And we talk about growth. It doesn't have to be downhill and negative and money, down the drain. It's job creation. It's exactly what politicians want and what ministries of finance need, because it's jobs and economic development. So engage with the ministries of finance. I think these are wonderful presentations from the countries today because you have concrete examples. Those examples can now be scaled. So look at how much it will cost to scale those. That's a very clear funding proposal that can be put behind a green bond or a carbon trade, or mobilization of finance in different ways. And we've heard some great examples as well on the gold standard side. So we've all got these solutions. Now it's time to very systematically scale them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, colleagues, scaling up adaptation actions to counter climate impacts. The side event, jointly organized by the government of Sri Lanka and Global Green Growth Institute, will come to an end right now. So let's give a round of applause to everyone who is here. Thank you very much for participating, for engaging actively. And before I wind up, I must let you know the refreshments are served towards the backside, towards the door end of this hall, and every participant will get a special gift from Sri Lanka. I'm sure you have heard of Ceylon cinnamon, #1 cinnamon in the whole world, and there's a pack, a sample pack for you all. It's a spice, as you all know. Ceylon cinnamon very recently got the GI indication from European Union that gives identification, the specific identification of Ceylon cinnamon. So with that, inviting you to collect your souvenir before you leave this hall, and also while inviting you to enjoy the refreshment, let me wind up the session. Thank you very much.